3 weeks before my sophomore year of college, my father asked me, genuinely confused, why I'd suddenly stopped paying my tuition, as if the answer wasn't sitting in his own bank statements. The $40,000 my grandmother had left, specifically for my education, held in an account my father controlled as trustee until I turned 25, was gone. Spent, over the previous 11 months, on my older brother's wedding, the open bar, the string quartet, a honeymoon in Santorini that ran nearly $9,000 on its own. I found out by accident, staring at a balance of $211 on a portal that was supposed to show tens of thousands. I want to walk you through exactly how my father managed to spend a dead woman's final gift to me on someone else's honeymoon, and exactly what happened when the person who actually caught him wasn't me at all. It was my grandmother's own attorney, 6 weeks later, during a routine review neither of us knew was coming. Quick facts before anything else. I was 19 at the time, halfway through my first year at a state university, studying mechanical engineering on a partial merit scholarship that covered tuition, but nothing close to the full cost of attendance. My grandmother, my father's mother, passed away when I was 14, and in her will, she left $40,000 specifically earmarked for my granddaughter's education, placed in a trust my father administered until I turned 25, at which point any remaining funds would transfer fully into my name. My brother, Colin, is 6 years older than me. He got married the summer between my freshman and sophomore year to a woman named Bethany in a wedding that, by every account, cost considerably more than my father's public salary as a mid-level insurance adjuster should have comfortably allowed. I didn't put those two facts together until a bank portal glitch showed me a balance that made absolutely no sense. Before I tell you how I found out, I need you to understand exactly what that trust meant to me, and exactly how much my father had already been quietly treating temporary as a word with no real meaning, long before the wedding ever happened. My grandmother, Rosalind, was the one person in my family who took my academic ambitions seriously from the time I was small. She was the one who bought me my first chemistry set, who sat through hours of my rambling explanations about how bridges distribute load, who told me, more than once, that she believed I'd do something real with an engineering degree someday. When she got sick, during my freshman year of high school, one of the last real conversations we had was about college, about making sure the money situation would never be the reason I couldn't finish something I'd started. She left the $40,000 specifically in a trust, rather than an outright gift, on the advice of her attorney, because I was only 14 at the time, and she wanted the funds protected and properly managed until I was old enough to handle them myself. She named my father as trustee, which, in hindsight, is the single decision in this entire story I think she would take back if she possibly could have known what he'd eventually do with that trust. For the first 4 years, the account functioned more or less as intended. My father used a portion of it, appropriately, to cover some of my private high school tuition during my junior and senior years, expenses my grandmother's will explicitly permitted, since her language allowed for educational expenses broadly construed, rather than strictly college costs. I want to be fair here. Those early withdrawals were legitimate, documented, and exactly the kind of use my grandmother had intended. The trouble started, quietly, about 18 months before the wedding, in ways I didn't fully register as trouble at the time. Here are 3 moments, spread across those 18 months, that I only understood in hindsight as the beginning of my father treating that trust as a flexible family resource instead of the protected inheritance it was legally supposed to be. Moment 1. About 2 years ago, my father asked me, somewhat casually, whether I'd mind if he borrowed a little from the trust to help cover a temporary cash flow issue at home, promising he'd replace it within a couple of months once a work bonus came through. I said yes, trusting him completely, because he was my father and the trustee, and I had no reason at that point to imagine he'd treat that permission as an open door rather than a one-time exception. He borrowed roughly $3,000. I never saw documentation of it being repaid, though at the time I didn't think to ask for any, because why would I audit my own father? Moment 2. About a year before the wedding, my father mentioned, again casually, that he'd used some trust funds to help with a down payment on a small rental property he was investing in, framing it as smart, temporary use of otherwise just sitting money that would, he assured me, generate returns that would ultimately benefit the trust itself. I remember feeling a flicker of unease at the time, something about investing my education money in a rental property, not quite sitting right. But I didn't push back, partly because I was 18 and didn't fully understand trust law, and partly because my father has always had a particular talent for making his decisions sound both obviously reasonable and slightly beyond question, the tone of someone who expects to be trusted rather than someone inviting real scrutiny. Moment 3, the one that, looking back, should have been an unmistakable warning sign. About 7 months before the wedding, I asked my father directly, during a conversation about my upcoming sophomore year costs, whether the trust still had enough to comfortably cover the next 3 years of tuition and housing. He said, without hesitation, "Don't worry about it, there's plenty." A specific, confident reassurance that turned out to be almost entirely untrue by the time I actually needed the money. I remember that reassurance clearly, because it's the exact sentence I kept replaying, months later, staring at a balance of $211, trying to understand how plenty had become almost nothing in the span of half a year. By the time Colin's wedding actually happened, my father had already established, quietly and gradually, a pattern of treating my grandmother's trust as a flexible resource he could dip into whenever something else in the family needed funding, always with a reassurance, always with an implied promise of eventual repayment that never seemed to fully materialize. The wedding wasn't really a single catastrophic decision. It was the largest, most expensive expression of a habit he'd already spent nearly 2 years quietly building. Here's exactly how the wedding spending happened, and exactly why my father apparently believed I would never find out the real extent of it. Colin's wedding took place the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, an event my whole family had been excited about for the better part of a year. I remember it being genuinely lovely, a beautiful venue, excellent food, a level of polish that, at the time, I assumed my parents had budgeted for carefully within their normal means, the way any family plans for a significant milestone event. What I didn't know, standing at that wedding in a bridesmaid dress, genuinely happy for my brother, was that my father had, over the preceding 11 months, made a series of withdrawals from my grandmother's trust, totaling just under $37,000. The venue deposit, a significant portion of the catering and open bar costs, the string quartet, and, most gallingly, nearly $9,000 toward Colin and Bethany's honeymoon in Santorini, a trip I only learned the exact cost of months later, during a conversation I was never supposed to overhear. I want to be honest that I don't believe my father set out, from the very beginning, to drain my education fund specifically for this purpose. I think, based on later conversations, that he genuinely believed, at least initially, that he'd find a way to replace the money before I needed it for sophomore year. Some combination of a work bonus, selling off part of that rental property investment, general optimism that things would work out the way they always seem to in people's minds, right up until they don't. But intention aside, the money was gone, spent on an increasingly expensive wedding that grew, invoice by invoice, well beyond what my parents' actual income could have supported without that trust quietly absorbing the difference. I found out 3 weeks before my sophomore fall semester was set to begin, when I logged into the trust's online portal to check the balance before submitting a housing deposit, expecting to see something in the range of $35,000 to $40,000 remaining. Instead, I saw $211. I called my father immediately, genuinely assuming it had to be some kind of banking error, a glitch, a wrong account displayed. He didn't answer right away. When he finally called back, nearly 4 hours later, his explanation came out slowly, reluctantly, in pieces. The wedding costs, the rental property, a version of, "we were always planning to pay it back," that grew less convincing with every additional detail he offered. And then, almost unbelievably, in that very same conversation, he asked me, with what sounded like genuine confusion rather than guilt, why I'd suddenly stopped paying my tuition installment that was due that week, as though the two things, the empty trust and my sudden inability to pay for school, were entirely unrelated coincidences he expected me to help him puzzle out. I didn't yell during that phone call. What I did instead is the part of this story that actually mattered most, and it started with a single email I sent that same night. I want to walk through exactly what I did in the days after that phone call, because I think the choice I made mattered more than any angry confrontation could have. I didn't scream at my father, though I understood, even then, why some people in my position might have. Instead, I spent that first night gathering every piece of documentation I could find, old statements from the trust's online portal going back as far as the system allowed, screenshots, the original language of my grandmother's will, which I'd kept a copy of in a folder since her passing. I wanted to understand, precisely, what my father was legally allowed to do as trustee, and what he very clearly was not. The next morning, I called my grandmother's estate attorney directly, a woman named Miss Alvarez, who had handled the original trust paperwork 5 years earlier and who I remembered meeting once, briefly, at the reading of the will. I explained the situation as calmly and factually as I could manage, sent her the documentation I'd gathered, and asked her, plainly, what my options actually were. Miss Alvarez's response, over a call 2 days later, changed the entire direction of what happened next. She told me that a trustee has a strict legal fiduciary duty to use trust funds only for the purposes explicitly outlined in the governing document. In this case, my education, with the narrow additional allowance for broader educational expenses my grandmother's will had specified. Using trust funds for a family wedding, a honeymoon, or a private real estate investment unrelated to my education was not a gray area. It was, in her words, about as clear a breach of fiduciary duty as I've seen in a family trust case, and she told me I had real legal standing to petition the court to have my father removed as trustee and held accountable for restoring the funds. I hadn't called her planning to pursue anything that serious. I genuinely just wanted to understand my options, but hearing her lay it out that plainly, that what my father had done wasn't just a painful family betrayal, but an actual, provable breach of a legal duty, shifted something in how I understood the situation. This wasn't simply a hard family conversation I needed to have. It was a legal matter, with real remedies available, and I decided, over the following week, that I was going to pursue it. What happened once Ms. Alvarez formally opened a review of the trust is the part of this story my father genuinely did not see coming, because he had no idea just how thoroughly documented his own withdrawals actually were. Ms. Alvarez initiated what's called a formal accounting request, a legal mechanism that requires a trustee to produce a complete, itemized record of every transaction made from a trust, with documentation justifying each one against the terms of the governing will. My father, as trustee, was legally obligated to comply. I want to be honest that I felt real fear during this period, not about the legal process itself, but about what it would do to my family. My mother called me multiple times during those weeks, alternating between genuine distress about the situation and, at times, a kind of pleading on my father's behalf, asking whether there was some other way to handle this that didn't involve lawyers and formal accountings. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I'd tried the other way first. I'd called my father directly, given him the chance to explain, and what I'd gotten back was an explanation that treated my missing tuition money as a confusing coincidence rather than a direct consequence of his own choices. I told her I didn't feel like I had another reasonable option left. Colin, for his part, found out about the full situation roughly 2 weeks into the accounting process, when our mother, in a moment of overwhelmed honesty, told him everything, including the specific detail that nearly $9,000 of his honeymoon had come directly from my education trust. I remember the message he sent me that night, still on my phone, which I've kept. I had no idea. I swear to God, I had no idea any of this came from your money. I would never have let them do that if I'd known. I believed him, and still do. Colin's guilt over the following weeks was visible and, I think, genuine. He hadn't asked for an extravagant wedding funded by his sister's education money. He'd simply trusted, the way I had, that our father was managing family finances responsibly, without either of us thinking to ask hard questions about exactly where the money for an increasingly elaborate wedding was actually coming from. The formal accounting, once completed, confirmed everything Ms. Alvarez had suspected: $36,800 in documented withdrawals over 11 months, tracing directly and unambiguously to wedding vendors, a honeymoon travel agency, and the rental property purchase, none of which fell within any reasonable interpretation of educational expenses under my grandmother's will. My father's own bank records, subpoenaed as part of the formal process, made the pattern undeniable in a way no verbal explanation could talk its way around. What my father said when he was finally confronted with the complete, itemized accounting in front of Ms. Alvarez and a court-appointed mediator is the part of this story I still think about the most. The formal mediation session took place about 10 weeks after I'd first discovered the empty balance. A conference room, a mediator, Ms. Alvarez present on my behalf, my father with an attorney of his own he'd hired once he understood how serious the situation had become. I want to describe my father's demeanor honestly, because it wasn't simple villainy. He looked, throughout most of that meeting, genuinely worn down, older than I remembered him looking even a few months earlier. When the itemized accounting was read aloud, item by item, vendor by vendor, he didn't argue with the facts. He couldn't, really. The documentation was too complete. What he offered instead, when finally asked directly why he'd done it, was something quieter and more honest than I expected. He said he'd wanted to give Colin the wedding he deserved, that he'd felt, as Colin's wedding costs kept climbing, an increasing pressure to make it match what Bethany's family, who came from more money, was contributing on their side, and that somewhere in that pressure, he'd convinced himself the trust withdrawals were temporary, manageable, something he'd sort out before I actually needed the money. I asked him, directly, whether it had ever occurred to him, at any point across those 11 months, that he was spending his own mother's final gift to his daughter on his son's open bar. He didn't have a clean answer. He said, quietly, that he'd told himself, each time, that it was just one more withdrawal, one more manageable exception, and that somewhere in the accumulation of just one mores, he'd lost track of how much he'd actually taken, until the number was already catastrophic. Ms. Alvarez, for her part, was measured but firm throughout, laying out clearly what the law required: full restoration of the improperly withdrawn funds, with interest, and, given the severity and duration of the breach, formal removal of my father as trustee, with a neutral, court-appointed financial institution taking over management of what remained of the trust until I turned 25. My father didn't contest any of it. I think, by that point, his own attorney had made clear how weak his position actually was, and some part of him, I believe, was almost relieved to have the decision taken out of his hands entirely, rather than continuing to manage a situation he'd clearly lost control of long before I ever found that empty balance. The restoration of the funds is really only half of this story. What happened over the following year, inside my actual family relationships, is the part that mattered more in the long run. I want to be honest that winning the legal remedy didn't feel like the triumphant ending it might sound like from the outside. My father was required to restore the full amount, with interest, which he did over the following year by selling the rental property at a modest loss and taking out a personal loan to cover the remaining gap. A genuinely difficult, humbling process for him that I watched unfold with a complicated mixture of vindication and real sadness, because underneath the anger, he was still my father, and watching him unravel his own finances to fix what he'd done was never something I felt purely good about. My relationship with him took a long time to rebuild, and honestly, it's still not fully what it was before. He apologized, more than once, in ways that felt increasingly genuine as time went on, rather than performative, in the way his initial phone call explanation had been. About 8 months into the process, he told me, without my having asked, that he'd started seeing a financial counselor, partly at Ms. Alvarez's suggestion during the mediation process, to understand why he'd made the specific choices he'd made and how he'd let a single wedding's costs spiral into something that compromised his own daughter's education. I don't know exactly how much of that reflection was genuine versus performed for my benefit, but the sustained effort over many months, rather than a single dramatic apology, is what eventually started to feel real to me. Colin and I grew closer through this, somewhat unexpectedly. He insisted, against my initial objections, on personally repaying a portion of the honeymoon costs directly to me, separate from our father's court-mandated restoration, framing it as something he needed to do for his own conscience, rather than something I demanded of him. I eventually accepted it, not because I needed the money at that point, but because I understood it mattered to him to make that specific gesture, and refusing it would have denied him something he genuinely needed to do to feel right about what had happened. My mother's role in all of this remains the most complicated part for me, honestly. She knew, at least in general terms, that the wedding was costing more than they could comfortably afford, and while I don't believe she fully understood, in real time, exactly where the money was coming from, I do think she chose not to ask hard questions she probably should have asked. We've talked about this more than once, and she's acknowledged it, though our relationship still carries some real strain from that period that I don't think will ever fully disappear. I finished my degree, eventually, on schedule, with the restored trust funds properly managed by the new, court-appointed trustee for the remainder of my time in school. I graduated with my mechanical engineering degree exactly 3 years after standing in that portal, staring at $211, trying to understand how $40,000 my grandmother had specifically protected for this exact purpose had nearly disappeared into someone else's wedding. There's a wider pattern underneath this story that I think matters more than the specific dollar amount, and it's worth sitting with before I wrap this up. I've thought a lot about why this particular betrayal cut as deep as it did. Deeper, honestly, than the dollar amount alone could explain. I think it's because my grandmother's trust wasn't just money. It was one of the last tangible pieces of a relationship I'd lost too early. A specific, deliberate act of care from someone who believed in me before I'd really had the chance to prove anything to anyone. When my father spent that money on someone else's wedding, it didn't just cost me tuition dollars. It quietly erased something my grandmother had built, specifically, carefully, for me, replaced, invoice by invoice, with an open bar and a honeymoon in Santorini for people who never knew, at the time, what they were actually funding. I think about how easy it was for my father to arrive at that decision too, not through one dramatic, villainous choice, but through a slow accumulation of just one more withdrawal, each one individually justifiable in the moment, until the total became something he could no longer explain or undo. That's a pattern I think a lot of people recognize from their own families, in smaller and larger forms, the slow normalization of using a resource that was never actually meant for the person using it, one reasonable sounding exception at a time, until the exception becomes the entire structure. If you've ever had something specifically, deliberately set aside for you, an inheritance, an opportunity, a piece of someone else's care, quietly redirected towards someone else's more urgent, more visible need, I think you already recognize the shape of this story long before I got to that balance of $211. That particular kind of loss is hard to fully name because it usually isn't framed, even by the person responsible, as a real betrayal. It's framed as a temporary exception, a reasonable choice under pressure, right up until someone finally adds up the total and understands exactly what it actually cost. If you've made it this far, I want to know, has something specifically meant for you ever been quietly redirected towards someone else in your family? One small exception at a time. Tell me what happened in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the most powerful stories on this channel have started exactly there. If this story hit close to home, there's more coming. I post a new one every few days, so if you don't want to miss the next one, you already know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.